All right. So here I want to look at what Mill has to say about the time to calculate objection. The time to calculate objection is often pressed against Mill. Honestly, what he had to say that I discussed in the previous video about this setting the standard too high thing actually fully answers the time to calculate question. If you're not using the utilitarian principle in actually making your decision, if you're actually thinking about other stuff, if your motivations are not produce the best consequences for all of humankind, or actually all of sentient kind, then you don't have to calculate. So that would have been enough to respond to this objection. People will say, well, you can't actually figure out what all the consequences of your actions will be. And Mill would just say, you don't have to figure it out. What's true is, if in actual fact your action produces the best consequences, then it was right. If it doesn't, it wasn't right. But that doesn't mean you have to do the calculation first. Now, that does mean there's a certain kind of riskiness involved in moral decision making. You can't be sure that what you're doing is going to be the right thing on Mill's view, especially if you're not actually doing the calculations. I'll just point out this kind of riskiness is also a feature of Kant's view. Kant thinks there's an element of riskiness when you try to do the right thing. Not because you don't know what the consequences of your action will be, because for Kant, the consequences don't matter all that much. There's ways they can matter. I mean, you ought to care about the consequences, right? That ought to play a role in how you're thinking about things. Like imagine if you applied the universalization test and just never thought about how things would turn out, right? That, like, imagine applying that test, the universalization test, to the idea or to the maxim that I shall be completely oblivious to how my actions turn out. Could you want everyone to act like that? No, you couldn't, right? So Kant can care about consequences, but they don't enter in all that much, right? Like he says, the consequences of your actions don't make them right, according to Kant. For Mill, they do. For Kant, the way the riskiness comes in is that Kant doesn't think you ever know for sure what your motivation is. Right? Kant thinks you have a lot of motivations to do things, some of them right, some of them wrong, and you don't know which one is actually explaining your behavior. So you don't know whether what you did was actually right, whether it was the right thing to do. For Mill, who thinks utilitarianism tells you what the right answer is, it's just not always something you can use or appeal to. So you use other principles, right? You act on other motivations. There's an element of riskiness because those other motivations aren't going to perfectly line up with what utilitarianism says the right action will be. So, for example, most of the time, if you act from the motivation of really just looking out for you, your friends, your neighbors, people who are important to you, if you just usually just focus on helping them, Mill might say, well, you're probably going to do the right thing most of the time. Right? Well, because those are the people you have the most impact on anyway, right? Like if you don't spend a lot of time thinking about people who live on completely other side of the world from you, well, you can't do much about them anyway, Mill would have thought, right? The only people who can do much about people all over the world are the really, really powerful. Ordinary, everyday people can't do much. Now, that's something that may have changed in the 150 years or so since Mill wrote, and today, I mean, you could right now give money to a charity that could save people's lives on the other side of the world. But definitely in Mill's time, if you were just an ordinary Englishman, like walking around and you only gave thought to your family, your friends, the people in your neighborhood, 98% of the time, that motivation is going to lead you to do the right thing anyway, right? If you genuinely care about them. But sometimes it won't. Sometimes you'll be in a position where your actions can hurt people you don't know seriously. And if you never think about them, if you're only thinking about you and yours, you can do the wrong thing, right? Acting on the same motivation that would normally lead you to do the right thing. Because that motivation isn't actually the standard, right? Helping your family, friends, and neighbors, for Mill, is never the standard, but it's okay for it to be the motivation. What that means is you don't have to calculate. So Mill could have just said, you know, I already answered this. But that's not what he does. He actually does something very interesting. In a way, you can almost see it as a kind of extension of or development of the very same ideas he developed in response to the setting the standard too high objection. There he said, you can have any motivation you want, right? As long as it's approximately good, right? As long as it's going to do a decent enough job, you can go with it, because you can't actually act on the utilitarian principle all the time. That can't actually be your motivation most of the time. Here what he says is we need to distinguish between sort of first principles or ultimate principles and what he calls secondary principles. Right? So we have our ultimate principle. And that is compatible, he says, with having various secondary principles. So he compares it to someone who has a religiously based moral view. And he says, all right, take somebody who thinks the right thing to do is to do as God wants me to do. All right, that's your ultimate principle. The right thing to do is to obey God's commands and wishes, right? And to do as God would wish or want or love us to do. That is very abstract. It's kind of vague. It's very general. In order to apply it, you need to know what God wants, loves, desires, things like that. And what Mill says is, well, you got that, right? If you're, like, let's say you're Christian, you got that in the Bible. The Bible has all sorts of places. It has some very clear rules, like it has the Ten Commandments. It also has the parables and stuff in the New Testament. There's all sorts of stuff you can go to in the Bible to figure out what it is that God wants you to do. And what Mill says is, well, just like you don't have to go check the Bible every time you perform an action because you've been reading the Bible your whole life. You already know what's in it, right? You've already worked out what you're supposed to do before you ever face the decision, like whatever decision, moral decision you're facing at the moment. You've already been reading the Bible for, years, decades, whatever. And so you don't have to figure it out fresh each time you make a decision. He says, similarly, utilitarians don't. Utilitarian's ultimate principle isn't do what God wants. Utilitarian's ultimate principle is perform that action that leads to the best consequences in terms of pleasure for sentient kind, all beings capable of having pleasure or pain. That's the very general principle. Again, it's abstract, it's kind of vague. You don't know what it says to do in particular circumstances. But, Mill says, you've had your whole life prior to whatever moral decision you're facing to figure out what particular kinds of things you ought to do, generally speaking. In fact, you have the whole experience of all of humankind figuring out what kinds of behaviors have good consequences and what kind don't, right? So, for example, you have the whole long history of human experience showing you that beating up everyone who bothers you doesn't work out. It makes you less happy in the long run. Even if you're good at beating people up, it's going to make you less happy in the long run. If you're bad at beating people up, you just get beat up a lot because you'll lose the fight. And also, it makes other people really unhappy. You don't need to recalculate that every time. Let's say somebody's in front of you insulting you, and you're wondering, morally, should I punch this person in the face? What Mill thinks is, you don't have to, wonder much. That's already been figured out. You've probably figured it out for yourself. And if you haven't figured it out for yourself, you have really good evidence that over time in human society, it hasn't worked out well. So don't do it. So a rule like don't beat up people for insulting you, don't beat up people for annoying you, is a kind of secondary principle. It's a principle of action that is endorsed by the ultimate principle, utilitarianism. Why? Well, because that principle, when followed, will tend to increase pleasure for sentient beings. Okay. So he makes that analogy, but there's an issue here. One thing, and it really has to do with the status of these secondary principles, right? One thing you might think about these secondary principles is that they're what you might call rules of thumb. Right? Rules of thumb are rules that are generally true, but sometimes false. So don't lie. Most people treat as a moral command that's usually right, but sometimes wrong. Sometimes it's okay to lie, right? Like let's say you find out, like you have a grandparent who's sick and dying, or just some relative who's sick or dying, and they're on their deathbed, and you just found out, right, that their spouse, who passed away years ago, had a long-running affair, right? And then you show up in the room where they're laying down and family members are talking to them, and they say something along the lines of, and my Jimmy, or let's say he's Jimmy, Jimmy's the name of their dead spouse. No one ever had a bad word to say about him. He would never do blah, 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 blah. And one of the things he lists is like adultery, or one of the things your relative lists is adultery. And you're sitting there like, oh man. And then she says, don't you all agree? And now you're stuck, right? If you don't answer, that's basically your way of saying, yeah, I think he would have cheated on you. If you do answer, your choice is either tell her on her deathbed, right, that her husband cheated on her, or lie. And I think what most of us would say is, just lie here, dude. What good does it do to tell her now, right? Maybe, right, while he was alive, it was a good idea to tell her because she deserves to not be lied to by her spouse. She deserves to have him stop doing it, or to have to face her with doing it, have to finally be honest. Maybe that makes sense. Maybe even after the spouse died, but she is still like living her life. Maybe it's still worth telling her because she deserves the chance to sort of live in the truth and come to terms with it, right? And come to maybe a better overall understanding of her life. Maybe. But like, if this is her last days, what's she going to do with that except be miserable her last few days? So generally speaking, you should tell people the truth. But sometimes you shouldn't, right? When your kids ask you, how's my art, Daddy? And I gotta say, like, if I was being honest, I'd be like, it's not good. You're not good at that, right? Find something else that you might be good at, right? I shouldn't say that. It's horrible. Most of the time you should be honest with people, right? Like I've had to sometimes be honest with students who've come to me and said, I really think I want to go to grad school for philosophy, the subject I teach primarily. And I've had to tell them like, that's not a good idea. You shouldn't do that. And I try to like, sugarcoat the reason sometimes, like say, well, it's a bad job market. You have other skills too that might be easier to find a job in. But I usually have to tell them at some point, and I actually usually say it just this way. There's no point in going to grad school for philosophy unless you go to a pretty high-ranked grad school, because otherwise you're not going to get a job. And then I hit them with and I don't think you could get into a highly ranked grad school, right? You have to do those things sometimes, right? And in fact, a lot of times it would pay for us to be a lot more honest than we are, but there are definitely some times when we shouldn't be. And if you agree with me on that, then you think the don't tell people lies thing, right, is a good rule of thumb, but a person with judgment will know sometimes you don't do it. These are exactly the kinds of rules that someone like Aristotle would have said are the best kind of rules we can get, right? We can't get to rules that absolutely get the right answer all the time. The best we can get is rules that are true most of the time. And a virtuous, practically wise person, according to Aristotle, will be able to tell when the rule applies, which is usually, and when it doesn't. So what Mill could mean is we've got our ultimate principle, and it is always true. The ultimate principle is really just these two principles put together. The right action is the one that maximizes good consequences for all, and pleasure is the only good, pain is the only bad, or hedonism. So what Mill could be saying is those principles put together, which he often refers to as the principle of utility, that's true all the time. But we also have these secondary principles that are good rules of thumb, and our personal experience and the experience of other people over time have led us to conclude that following these principles most of the time will work. And so those are the principles you should follow. They'll get the wrong answer sometime, but not most of the time. But importantly, you're not calculating the consequences of each and every action, What you're doing is taking a look at the action and saying, all right, what kind of action is this? And then once you figure out what kind of action it is, like maybe it's a lie, or maybe it's a returning to someone what they let you borrow, or all sorts of action types, then you consult the rules of thumb that you've learned through your personal experience, that you've picked up from other people. And you see, okay, in general, should I tell lies? No. And maybe you have some idea about what you should, about when there should be exceptions to that rule. You ask, all right, is this one of the general exceptions to this rule? Yes or no, right? But you're not calculating, right? You're not saying, all right, what are all the effects of telling a lie in this case versus not telling a lie? Because that would be too difficult. You can't trace all the effects of each individual action. So you use rule of thumb. That's one way of reading Mill. I think in this passage, at least, it's the correct way of reading Mill. I think what Mill's suggesting here is rules of thumb, in part because it fits so well with that earlier passage, which says you can have motivations different than the motivation of following the utility principle. He nowhere commits himself to saying those other motivations will always get you the right answer. In fact, it seems pretty clear he thinks they won't. And it would make sense if those other motivations were these secondary principles, these rules of thumb, moral rules of thumb. But there are those who have attributed to Mill a different view, which says secondary principles aren't rules of thumb, they are exceptionless moral rules. Now, how could that be? How could the secondary principles be exceptionless moral rules? Well, they could be exceptionless moral rules if, when taken together, all the secondary principles you have would lead you to perform the exact same actions that the principle of utility would tell you to perform if you could do the calculations. But that's incredibly unlikely, right? It's incredibly unlikely that you're going to be able to find rules simple enough for you to actually use, because remember, the whole point of introducing these secondary principles is to make it clear there's a simpler way to make moral decisions than to calculate the results or the likely consequences of every action you perform. So these secondary principles have to be simple. It's incredibly difficult to imagine how you could come up with simple rules, a set of simple rules that will always get the right answer according to the utility principle. Because while you don't have to do the calculations every time, Mill thinks, it's still true on this principle that the right action is the one that maximizes good consequences for all, that what the correct answer is to what you should do does depend on all those things you would be calculating if you had to do the calculations. It depends on every last little impact that your action could have. And every one of your actions can have all sorts of impacts that you don't know about. In fact, just tracing the results of any particular action you performed is incredibly difficult. And then keep in mind, it's not just the action you actually performed that you have to do that for. You have to do it for all the other actions you could have performed if you were doing the calculations. And that is going to, for every choice you make, mean that there's an incredibly huge number of factors that are relevant to determining what the right action is. Now, what Mill has said is, but they're not relevant to your actual decision making. You shouldn't try to keep track of all of them. But that level of complexity means it's very unlikely that these rules are going to get the right answer all the time. And because of this, there are people who think Mill actually, in this passage, and in a few other passages in the book, is actually rejecting act consequentialism. And they attribute to him an alternative view called rule consequentialism. As a replacement for act consequentialism. What's rule consequentialism say? Well, rule consequentialism says an act or action is morally right when it is commanded by the morally correct set of rules. Okay, But that doesn't tell you anything unless you know what the morally correct set of rules are. So how do we tell what the morally correct set of rules are? Don't worry, rule consequentialism has an answer. The morally correct set of rules is that set of rules, I'm going to run out of space here, that would, if X, and I'm going to get back to why I'm using a variable here in a minute, accepts them, will lead to the best consequences. Okay, so in the place of 1, you get now a new 1 and 2, which would mean hedonism would become 3. Right? All right, now let's take a look at this thing I've just written. Rule consequentialism. Sorry for the terrible handwriting. But I'll read it out. An action is morally right when it is commanded by the morally correct set of rules. The morally correct set of rules is that set of rules that would, if X accepts them, will lead to the best consequences. Okay. I'm going to explain this with 2 different things you could put in place for X. One thing you could put in place for X is you. Another thing you could put in place of X is society as a whole, if everyone accepted it. Let's do it first with you. Then it would say the right thing to do is the thing that the morally correct set of rules say to do. And the morally correct set of rules is that set of rules that would, if you accepted them, lead to the best consequences. So you have to imagine that you've accepted some set of rules, what Mill was talking about when he was talking about secondary principles. Relatively simple, straightforward rules that don't require you to do any advanced calculation. Rules that just say there's certain types of actions you shouldn't perform, except maybe with some exceptions. Who knows? But we'll get to exceptions in a minute. So you have some set of rules that say, like, don't kill people. Right? Then you maybe another rule that says don't steal, don't lie, right? Don't make unwanted sexual advances on people. Right? Corollary, figure out whether sexual advances are wanted or not before you make them. You have some set of rules, and what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to say, all right, what would happen if I accepted this set of rules? What kind of actions would I perform? And what kinds of effects would those actions have? And you then try to figure out, well, what would be best? Right? Which set of rules would be best? Because let's say you've got that first set of rules, don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, no unwanted sexual advances on others. And let's say you compare it to another rule. So like, kill when you want to, lie when you want to, steal when you want to, make sexual advances on anyone you want to. Compare these 2 sets of rules. Imagine you accept them and try to live by them. Which set of rules would lead to the best consequences? Well, clearly, if that's the comparison, the don't murder, don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, don't make unwanted sexual advances is going to win. Because all of those things, most of the time, lead to a reduction in overall pleasure, right? Lying, stealing, murdering, sexual harassment / assault, all make people less happy, generally. Whereas a rule that says to do them would, that means rules that say don't do them are going to improve overall happiness or pleasure, and rules that say to do them will reduce them. But you can't just compare these 2 sets of extreme rules. You have to compare different ways of living. And there is stuff in Mill that does incline some people to think this is what he means. Because he does, especially in some other books, talk a lot about different approaches to life and how you have to try out different approaches to life to see how they work. And so what some people think is, well, the approaches to life are just different rules to live by. And part of how you figure out which set of rules to ultimately live by is you try living by different sets of rules. And you see what the results are. Now, some you don't have to live by in order to tell first. You don't have to live by the kill anybody you want to rule in order to figure out it's not going to be a good rule. All you need is some basic knowledge about human society. But then there are some tough cases, right? Don't tell lies ever versus don't tell lies unless they are bad people you're lying to. Well, that's a tough one, right? If they're genuinely evil people, maybe lying to them is a good idea. Maybe that's what you should be doing, right? So you might need to try to live by one of them rather than another. And the idea is there is some set of rules. The idea behind rule consequentialism is there's some set of rules that would have the best consequences if you live by them. And then what that means is that's the morally correct set of rules. So 2, its only function is to help you pick the set of rules, which means the only way that consequences play a role here is in helping to pick the rules. Once the rules are picked, once an answer has been determined as to which set of rules has the best consequences if you accept them, then the right action is just whatever those rules say. You might be like, okay, what's the big deal? What's the difference between this, rule consequentialism, which I've got in purple, and the original act consequentialism view? Well, the fact that a set of rules would have the best consequences if you accepted them and lived by them in general doesn't mean that in each particular case following those rules would have the best consequences, right? So, because here's an example, right? Murdering babies is wrong. So, like everybody would accept that a rule that says don't murder babies is a good rule. It's going to make it into that set of rules that leads to the best consequences. But you can come up with crazy, weird examples where killing a baby is going to increase overall happiness, right? Let's say you find out that there's a baby who they're in the NICU, right? And they're inside one of those little incubators, and it's kept them isolated from everyone else. But you have just gotten back blood tests which show that if this baby's ever allowed out, there's something weird about its blood, right? There's something in its blood that is going to make other people sick with an incurable disease that will tear through the population, right? I'm making this in the time of COVID, and so this is what's on my mind. You know that if you show these results to the kids' parents, they're going to refuse to believe it because parents are irrational when it comes to their kids. And you know that, like, let's say the parents are really, really rich, and they're going to bribe the hospital administrators to let them take the kid out. And you know that if that happens, millions of people will die. Well, on act consequentialism, it's pretty clear what needs to happen, right? You need to kill the baby. But on rule consequentialism, it's going to say, well, let's consult the rules. And the morally correct set of rules has a don't murder a baby, right, rule in it. So that means the right action is to not murder a baby. And with the way I've set up the example, it seems like, well, but I mean, in this case, maybe you should murder the baby, right? But of course, think about ordinary cases, right? In any ordinary case, you're not going to run into that. So put that to one side. I wasn't there trying to develop an argument against rule consequentialism. I was just trying to give you an example that showed that rule consequentialism and act consequentialism can get different results, particularly when it comes to more mundane things like stealing. Right? In general, we're going to have rules if, in normal circumstances, for normal people living normal lives, the morally correct set of rules for them will include a don't steal rule. But of course, sometimes act consequentialism will say that, yeah, it's the right thing to do to steal. Right? And what rule consequentialism does is it says the consequences of any particular action are not what matters. It's only the consequences of you living by a certain set of rules that matters. So rule consequentialism, if you took that and replaced act consequentialism with rule consequentialism, would lead to a very different theory. Right? It would say that the right thing to do is whatever the rules say, and consequences only matter for picking the rules. They don't matter for picking the actions. And some people think that's what Mill's getting at with this passage where he's talking about secondary principles. So one thing you can think is he's just saying there's rules of thumb, right? And they won't get the right answer all the time, but they'll get the right answer enough. Another group of people say, no, he's talking about secondary principles that are exceptionless moral rules. And the only way that's going to make sense is with something like rule consequentialism. Now, I told you that there was an alternative for X, and that's doing what society accepts. So there you would just imagine not just you living by those rules, but everybody living by those rules. And different rule consequentialists will give different accounts of this. I just wanted to point out it actually leads to different results if you just make it yourself or society. Because it might be that you following one set of rules and everybody else following another set of rules could come out to be optimal. If the X here is supposed to just be you, then that would get reflected. But if everybody's supposed to live by the same set of rules, right, then you're asking, well, what if everybody follows these rules? And there you start getting something a little bit closer to Kant, right? And that comment that Mill had about Kant's moral theory ends up just becoming utilitarianism. A lot of people scratch their heads and say, pretty obviously not. But if Mill's actually a rule consequentialist, then maybe so. Because if the moral rules you should follow are the rules that would lead to the best situation for everybody, the most pleasant situation, if everybody followed that same set of rules, then you might think, well, isn't that the set of rules we would all pick in the kingdom of ends, right? The one that makes our lives go best? And so that has led some people to think, yeah, maybe Mill is being a rule consequentialist here. Now, I bring up rule consequentialism because it's a major theory. A lot of people have thought Mill holds it. I don't think Mill holds it. I think when Mill's talking about those secondary principles, he's just talking about rules of thumb. The theory that I think Mill holds, though, is actually neither rule consequentialism or the act consequentialism of Jeremy Bentham and his dad, James Mill. I think Mill holds another view, which has sometimes been called sanction utilitarianism or sanction consequentialism. But I can't explain that until we talk about the sanctions stuff in utilitarianism, the book. And that'll be for the next video.